Oh, hi everybody. It's meteorologist Joe Chaffee. It's a Friday night, starting off here at 7:03 Eastern Time on the 22nd of February 2019. It's Washington's his actual birthday today. I can still remember when this was the day off. We also used to have Lincoln's day off, Lincoln's birthday on the 12th, and then we'd have the 22nd off, and then they combined it all into President's Day to have one federal holiday. However, the week ahead here that we're looking at for next week in the long range, well, a lot of this is all going to be hinging on this intense storm that is going to be developing over the Great Lakes, because that really is going to be driving the pattern change going forward. But we have a ton of stuff going on tonight from that storm. Of course, the big story was the incredible snowfalls that occurred in Arizona, particularly in Flagstaff, 41 plus inches, greatest one storm total ever, and also the greatest 24-hour snowfall record was set there, 35 plus inches. I think those records all go back to 1915. So now we're going to start moving all this stuff to the east. And I got a couple of new maps to show you tonight, too, to help us along in this process that is happening meteorologically speaking. So we have a couple of new tools to take a look at, and you should use them as well. They're on the SPC site, and they are free, so which is always a good thing. Okay, so here's the National Weather Service watches and warnings map tonight, and no shocker, we've got a large area of blizzard warnings from northeastern Colorado through much of Kansas and eastern Nebraska, up through Iowa and southern Minnesota. The snowfall amounts that are going to be generated from this are not high. It's really the fact that the wind here is going to be a big player, and visibilities are going to be down to near zero. Remember, you don't need a heavy snowfall to have a heavy total snowfall to have a blizzard. You could have a blizzard with an inch of snow if you've got a lot of blowing snow around and gale force winds that are restricting visibility to under a quarter of a mile. So many of these areas are going to wind up with several to 6 inches. The higher amounts are going to be as you go further north up toward the lakes, the upper peninsula of Michigan, and I'll show you on the snow map. But all of what you see here in terms of warnings, advisories, and watches are all due to this storm. We've got winter storm warnings still up for eastern Arizona and much of western and northern New Mexico. Then you've got that orange blizzard warning up there that extends up into southern Minnesota, surrounded by winter weather advisories and a few winter storm warnings on the southern end and on the northern end. Still have a small area of watches up for northwestern Wisconsin, a small portion of northeastern Minnesota, and on the upper peninsula of Michigan on the eastern side, and still watches for much of western and northern Michigan. We are also seeing in the I don't know what color that is. It's kind of I don't know if that we can call that gold. I'm not sure, or brown, but that is the one that stands out more. Northern Illinois, Indiana, northern Ohio into Pennsylvania, high wind watches. Eastern Michigan, also high wind watches, and a lot of the areas that are under the various advisories and warnings are also under high wind watches as well. And we've got wind issues also back through Texas as this low comes out, and various wind advisories and high wind warnings that are up in that area. The flood watches that you see in the Ohio and Tennessee Valley, they continue. The rain there has been pretty much nonstop this week, and no surprise, thanks to WPC and their very alert forecast telling us of 7.5 inches or more of rain forecast for this area. We went back and showed you that forecast back days ago. Out in the west, there's some new energy coming in, so we have various flood watches, winter storm watches, and winter storm warnings extending from parts of Northern California on up into parts of Washington State, and then eastward into a couple of pockets there in Idaho and in through Montana and Wyoming. But everything that you see From the Rockies east, that is all due to this storm that is coming out of the southwest. And by the way, we do also have winter storm watches up for, you guessed it, northern Maine, because they're gonna probably wind up getting clobbered with this in that area in northern Maine. I believe they referred to that whole area up there as the county. Now, jump to the satellite view on the loop, because you can see, these ghost pictures are so useful, but there's a tropical feed of moisture that is coming out of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean that's zooming northward, and that is all getting drawn into this system, this large stream of moisture, and then you've got this jet of moisture that is running up from the tropical Pacific across Mexico into the Gulf, into the Western Gulf, and then on northeastward from there. And of course the arcing clouds, we've been in high clouds here in my area in the northeast from eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England, but just to the south you're getting this tropical plume of moisture producing those heavy rains across Tennessee, Arkansas, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, and points northward. And then you can see the separate energy in the southwest going more toward the left. You see that swirl there. That is the upper air system, the upper low that is getting kicked out of there in the west, in the southwest, and will basically pick up all this other stuff that's going on in the east and wrap it up into one very impressive low that is running up toward the Great Lakes. So let's begin our analysis tonight. And by the way, while we don't have we do have one small area of severe weather risk, but it's just a marginal risk of severe weather in eastern Texas, the northern half of Louisiana, southern Arkansas, and back into much of northwestern Mississippi. Now, this area is going to get expanded considerably tomorrow, and I think there's going to be some active severe weather going on during Saturday across much of the Tennessee and lower Ohio Valley and points southward with this storm. It really does look like a March storm more than anything else. With respect to the depth, and you start to get to this time of year where in the warm sector to the south you're seeing temperatures getting up into the 80s, and that is a key to a rather strong severe weather event. And always remember, for those of you who live in areas that are being threatened by severe weather, to be sure to check your latest radars and any of the latest watches and warnings that could be up by going to your local National Weather Service office or weather.gov. Now, some of this only goes back in terms of the data to 4 a.m. Arizona time. So there's still a lot more snow to be added to this, and when we see this tomorrow, I put the 72-hour snowfall totals here from the weather.gov/CRH/snowfall, and it has been really impressive. Flagstaff on this is only showing 18 inches, so it really doesn't include. It's missing at least 12 hours of data or more. So when we update this tomorrow, we'll look at this. I'm sure we're going to see that big, almost dark red spot or black. That's actually, that dark red spot there. That would be 36 inches or more. Prescott, Arizona, getting 12. Payson, Arizona, getting 8. There was actually snow reported in the suburbs of Phoenix today. I did see some video of that this afternoon. I saw it on one of the, I believe it was on YouTube. It's on there somewhere. And we're also seeing some snows now down in southern Arizona, down toward the Mexican border. Again, these amounts will all wind up being increased when we look at this map tomorrow. So all of this snow that you see in the southwest produced by this very, very strong upper air trough, shortwave trough, and cutoff low that is swinging through the southwest and is going to make this major storm that's headed up toward the Great Lakes. And again, with respect to future snow amounts here, the snow amounts, obviously, with the system getting kicked out now or diminishing in the southwest, but it's a stripe of snow running from Kansas, eastern Colorado through Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Nebraska up through Iowa. So again, you see the amounts here aren't all that big. They're talking, they've got it's a 4 to 8 inch range for the most part, but you'll get heavy snow for about 4 or 5 hours. You couple that with 40-mile-an-hour winds, you're going to have visibilities down near zero, so you've got your blizzard warning. The temperature criteria may not necessarily be there, but everything else will. And they took away the temperature criteria a long time ago. Used to be you had to have a temperature of at least 20 or less with all those other parameters in order to qualify as a blizzard. And then you start to get into some of the bigger amounts as you move up into Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan. We see some amounts of 15, 20 inches being indicated. The 19 is the max, so I just rounded it off to 20. And also through Monday afternoon, we've got more action coming in, obviously, in the west. We've got those winter storm warnings and watches and the flood watches up with respect to the snow amounts here. Looking at some pretty hefty amounts being indicated for parts of the mountains in Oregon. A 57 print. I love some of these big print numbers. A 40 print here, and also some big numbers being indicated in some of the mountains in Idaho and in western Wyoming and parts of western Montana. So it's pretty busy here, even extending down into southwestern Washington state. This is not reaching the coastal big cities here in Washington. Seattle on the edge of what looks like a coating to an inch, and the same for Olympia and Tacoma. But they still may wind up with some more accumulating snow next week with a few other systems that are going to be coming in to the west. Here's the surface map right now, and there we go, it's loading up. This is from 4 o'clock this afternoon, but I have an updated map from SPC that I'll show you in a second. But I want to at least show you the wide view here of the all the puzzle pieces, with that warm sector setting up out of the Gulf of Mexico and pushing northward. We've got temperatures across the Gulf states. I mean, this is really a ripe atmosphere with this developing storm. 70s with dew points in the low 70s, and you head out into Florida, you've got temperatures in the 80s. Even into southern Georgia, we've got temperatures up to the low 80s. Jump to the other side of the front in North Georgia and northern Alabama, and what have you got? 50s. So that's quite the contrast there. The front is analyzed right now as stationary. It's waiting for the energy that's coming out with the western low, and this is how it was analyzed with 2 low centers analyzed in New Mexico. Nothing particularly deep here in terms of pressures, getting close to 1,000 or just under 1,000 millibars, but that's pretty formidable for that area. And we're going to see this storm deepen another 20 millibars or so as it heads up toward the Great Lakes. And right now, through much of the area where the blizzard warnings are up, we have, at least through Kansas anyway, we've got temperatures above freezing in the upper 30s and low 40s. That's going to change. And there's colder air as you move up into Iowa and in through Minnesota. You start to get into teens and 20s. So all of that is going to wind up being drawn down to the south as this low intensifies it. And this is from SPC, the Storm Prediction Center. You can they plot these maps come up hour by hour. So instead of waiting for the 3-hour print off the WPC site, but the surface low seems to be somewhere in West Texas or southeast New Mexico. We've got 1,002 isobar there. I've also overlaid the latest radar, and there's the precip there. The radars always, when you look at them here in the southwest and in the Rockies and up through California, Washington, and Oregon, you've got the mountainous terrain getting in the way, so it doesn't really give you a true picture of just how much moisture you're dealing with here. Plus, you've got all kinds of local effects with upslope, downslope, and that kind of thing going on, depending on how the storm is oriented. But that's a fairly impressive radar that we're seeing at the moment. And you can, by the way, you go to spc.noaa.gov and you go to their meso analysis link, and we can you can switch around to different sectors. Here's the issue in the east as we go further east. Now we've got this boundary that is setting up, of course, in in the southeast and in the Gulf states, and there's this been almost continuous band of heavy downpours and heavy rains to the north of that for the last 2 days or so, and the rains that fell earlier during the week. So you've got heavy rain from across central Arkansas through western Tennessee and in through Kentucky and on up into West Virginia. I'll move the sector over to the east now. We'll take it to the northeast part of the U.S. And of course, you've got this 1032 high sitting north of Lake Ontario. That the high clouds, the high clouds and the blow off from the precip to the south has kept a lot of the area from eastern Pennsylvania to southern New England in cloud cover for the entire day. There were hints of sun early on, but these high clouds have been really, really stubborn and further north than modeled. So you wound up with the temperatures that really didn't go much of anywhere today. And those high clouds might thin out a bit tonight, but they'll fire up right back up tomorrow as we start to lift all of this up to the north. Here's the Storm Prediction Center's severe weather outlook for tomorrow. Enhanced risk, eastern Arkansas, the northern half of Mississippi, southwestern Tennessee, and a small portion of northwestern Alabama in enhanced risk, and you've got this much larger area of slight risk encased into a even larger area of marginal risk that goes up to southern Indiana and southern Illinois, the slight risk reaching into Kentucky and southernmost Illinois and southeastern Missouri. They kind of shaved off the northern end of this a little bit. I believe yesterday or the day before they had it pushed up into southern Ohio, but that's not unusual. Sometimes models can be a little bit too aggressive with trying to lift the warm front too far north. So they scaled it back a little bit, but it's still every bit as impressive as it was in terms of the scope of what's happening over the last 2 days on their latest forecast. And I'm sure they're going to be doing a bit more massaging. Here's the wide radar view, that arc of rain streaming, that moisture streaming up from the Gulf, and then you've got this arc of rain through Arkansas, Tennessee, into Kentucky, southern West Virginia, and now much of Virginia. The northern edge of that rain is just south of the Washington, D.C. area. The distinct pieces are pretty evident when you look at the radar. You've got that system in the southwest, the moisture that has set up in the east, and the warm sector that is setting up in the east, and then you've got some energy running through the northern plains that's running out ahead of it in North Dakota, in North and South Dakota, up into northwestern Iowa and into Minnesota. Some snow going on there right now. And now, of course, we're waiting for that southwestern piece. It's going to come along, pick all this up, and then take it on up to the Great Lakes and make it into a major storm. So I thought I'd start tonight with the via Tropical Tidbits. The maps on Tropical Tidbits, tropicaltidbits.com. For those of you who like to take a look at these maps on your own, I encourage you to do so. Now, I went back to, I'm going to go back here to Wednesday, because I want you to see, and we're up now at about 25,000 feet. The H's and L's that you're seeing here are the actual surface highs and lows, and then the colored areas are your jet streaks. And if you look to the side on the scale, that reddish purple, well, I don't even know what color that you would call that, but you've got that obvious purple area. And you go to where you got that almost reddish brown color that's where the 1039 is sitting. Those are winds in excess of 200 knots. And some of the upper air measurements that were taken earlier this week measured wind speeds in the Northeast. And this is this Pacific jet that has been so unrelenting. They measured wind speeds that were all-time records of up to 250 miles an hour. You can just imagine being a plane having to fly westward into that headwind, and on the other hand, a plane going with that wind as a tailwind, they get to save a lot of fuel. But the depth of the trough in the west is extensive, and when we put this in motion, watch that jet streak that's right over Alaska and runs down the west coast of Canada, the coast of Washington and Oregon, and then just dives right down into the southwest. I mean, that is a really was an impressive area of energy that moved down there and produced the big snows that we saw. And now we're going to watch this trough lift out to the northeast. And there's your surface low. And here's in terms of pressure, you're taking it from roughly 1,000 millibars down to about 977. So from 1 o'clock this afternoon to 1 o'clock Sunday, you're going to deepen this low almost 30 millibars. Well, 25 millibars over the next 48 hours. It's just going to be this sort of slow, steady deepening as it moves on up to the northeast and then carries itself off into southern Canada. The upper air here is, really quite impressive with this very, very strong shortwave just lifts up and up into southeastern Canada, and you wind up wrapping it up. Sorry, it's Friday. It's by the time I get to the end of the week, I get and depending on what kind of weather we've had during the week, completing sentences it becomes a challenge for me. So this is how it looks like way up in the atmosphere, and we've been saying how this unrelenting Pacific jet has had such a huge influence on the weather all across the U.S. And it with what we're seeing with this developing storm, you can understand how that is indeed the case. Here's how it looks at the surface, by the way. Your low by Saturday afternoon is in central Kansas. Then it jumps up into northwestern Illinois. Again, the snow area is very narrow. You get this narrow band of heavy snow, and this low moves very, very quickly. So there's not really enough time to put down more than 3 to 6 or 4 to 8 in the areas in the Central Plains. There's more to work with as you get further north, clearly. And now you've got this really wrapped up 977 low. Notice how tight those isobars are. You've got this big high coming down out of western Canada into Montana. Huge pressure change over a relatively small distance. So that means the pressure gradient is very tight, and you're going to see winds of 50 miles an hour or more out of this. Who knows, there might even be some renegade surface gust to hurricane force for somebody. And that gradient carries over into the northeast beginning later Sunday afternoon, but particularly Sunday night and on Monday. The gradient in the northeast down to the mid-Atlantic states and west to the eastern Great Lakes will be exceptionally tight, and I think we're going to wind up seeing gusts of 50 miles an hour from this. Out in the west, you've got this east-west band of snow that evolves from more energy that's coming into the northwest. You can see there's a surface low that's coming in there on Monday afternoon with heavy snows just inland and just to the south of Seattle, Tacoma. And there's more energy coming into the west as we go through next week. In the meantime, in the east, you're getting pieces of this that are going to be riding along. That energy is shooting over the top. You've got this area of snow that moves across the Great Lakes and then kind of slides into New York State for Wednesday night into Thursday. It goes just north of New York City. There's a very weak surface low that the GFS is picking out. Now, the Canadian model today was further south with this. The European, you could barely find this feature at all. I don't know how much energy to put into this. I'm not really overly enthused when we look at the upper flow of anything coming out of it. I suppose you could certainly argue that given the nature of the upper pattern, which we'll get to shortly, this thing could wind up being a little bit further to the south, and we'll have to watch for that, but it is a weak system. And I really think it's going to be very hard to get anything of depth here for the east this coming week. It looks like we have a series of weak systems. Here's another one that the GFS depicts for the end of the week with a low moving across the Carolinas, not a whole lot of cold air with it, and then it goes out. We have been pointing out the fact that there's no, the Atlantic jet is a problem. These lows, if you notice, they're just basically running out to the east. This first one moves out and goes out. The second one forms off the southeast coast, and that moves out. Then you've got this other one that comes into the southeast, and that goes out almost straight east. They're not lifting northward, and that is because of the state of the Atlantic jet, which is it's basically a fire hose from Charleston to Lisbon. It's almost a straight line when you look at it on the upper air. Now, I don't know why the GFS has been kind of targeting this idea of more important energy late next week coming out, and on this particular run, it cuts it to Detroit, Toronto, and wraps up another monstrous low north of Lake Huron. I'm not 100% sold on this idea. I think it has to do with how the GFS may be timing the upper air on this run. There wasn't a whole lot of support for this coming from the Canadian or the European, but at least on this run, it brings that energy and tries to phase it a bit. So let's run back to earlier this week, where you've got this ridge in the east. And of course, we had that whatever you want to call that event on Wednesday, the one that rhymed with the one from last Tuesday. There's your deep trough in the west, and that small but wrapped up upper low that just makes its way to the northeast, lifts up. There's another shortwave trough there up in Canada down through Lake Winnipeg that lifts it right up. And of course, you've got this big ridge that flies up into the east ahead of it, and then you begin to see the change in the overall pattern now. There's a colder flow from Canada, but if you look at the flow across the United States here for next week, it's this west-east, pretty much this westerly flow or a west-northwest flow. The shortwave troughs that are running along it in the northern, in that jet stream that is coming down from Canada into the Great Lakes and the Northeast, there's not a whole lot of identity to them. They just look kind of blah as they go by. And here's another one for Wednesday, Thursday. You can barely find the features in the southern stream. It's a flat flow. You can't do much with it. It's like a ruler across the southern half of the United States, and it continues right across the Atlantic. Now, with regards to that deeper system that it shows, it's because the model does bring in this, what looks like a powerhouse into the northwest at the end of next week, and then it's got this thing coming down in the northern jet where it phases it and brings that up into upstate New York and New England. I'm not 100% sold that it's going to play out that way. I would argue that the flat nature of the pattern would be an argument against all of this. Now, here's that Atlantic jet I was telling you about, and again, there's nothing out here. When you look at the flow across the Atlantic, if we go out to, I think the European even shows this better, so I'll switch to that. Look at this fire hose on the European. You can almost draw a straight line from Charleston to Lisbon. I've been saying Charleston to Lisbon, Portugal, not Spain. My mistake. From Charleston to Lisbon, and that is that's a straight shoot out east or east northeast. You got to have storms out in the Atlantic to create a traffic jam. If everything is moving from west to east, it really doesn't do you much good. And when we plot the surface features here on the European, what do you got? You've got a big high south of the Azores. You've got this low that's sitting northeast of the Bahamas. And even going forward, there's nothing. There's a monstrous low between Greenland and Iceland that is dominating the weather across the North Atlantic. But you want to see some lows out here doing something, so that you're creating a situation where you'll take a surface low and try to turn it up the East Coast. You just don't have it here. Even on the European, as you go forward, in its outlook for next week and on this run, it takes a low coming out of the Gulf and wraps it up east of North Carolina. But guess what? That's going to go east, northeast, or northeast. It's never going to have any impact with the upper air like this. Now, with regards to the long range, I would just again emphasize what I've been saying the last few days. We are going to go into a pattern that is, let's say, less unfavorable, but it's going to mean that for anything to happen as far as snow is concerned over the next 10 days to 2 weeks, you're going to have to time all these things out just perfectly. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with nothing as far as last chance snow events. And I would just say, with regards to these model runs, you're going to see these model runs change in terms of timing. What isn't going to change is the overall description of what I've given as far as the upper air pattern is concerned. That is going to remain the same. So you have to work within that context. And because we know what what the overall pattern is, at least we can understand how things are going to happen and why they may happen, and why we're arguing against another big storm to the lakes for next weekend, because I think it's just because the model timed out and phased it on this run. It may not do it on the next run. But one of the things I want to show you on the longer, as far as the longer range is concerned, is if you watch out in the Pacific, first we'll start with the European, and then we'll go to the GFS. But if you watch out in the Pacific, you'll notice here as we go into next week, the Pacific does look a bit different. There's traffic out there, but you still have some semblance of a straight line jet from off of Japan about halfway across the Pacific. And then as we go through time out to 240 hours, which is March 4th, that straight line jet extends further east. It's as if that fire hose is trying to find a way back to establishing itself across the entire length of the Pacific. And I think eventually it's going to get there. When it gets there, that is when you will wind up seeing the trough coming back in the west and the ridge starting to pop back up in the east. And on the GFS, if you go out beyond 240, you see that. You've got this almost straight line flow from Japan to 7/8 across the Pacific before you wind up with some kind of deep shortwave trough that is getting ready to come into California. But if you notice on the far right of the picture, over Florida and the southeast, what do you have over there? You have the ridge in the east coming back. So you've got a 10-day to 2-week window at most before I think you're going to see this pattern go back to what we have had over the last 4 weeks or so, and that to me means that a last hurrah of possibilities, however limited they will be, and then it's on to an on-time arrival of the spring season. And the state of the Atlantic jet, by the way, argues against any major storm forming and moving up the East Coast as a nor'easter. I've seen that question thrown around. I've been watching the straw grasping going on across social media land. And I kind of get it as a snow lover. You're trying to maybe hook yourself onto anything where there's a possibility. But, it's a bit on the hysterical side, I think, at this point. It's not there. Last year at this time, it's amazing when you compare last year, what was going on at this time last year. The attack and the breakdown of the polar vortex in the stratosphere was monumental, and it created a massive pattern change in the lower atmosphere that drove us to an incredible stormy month of March across the U.S. and particularly in the East. We all go back to those 4 nor'easters. It's rare that you see it happen in back-to-back years. So when you look at the vortex now in the upper atmosphere, it's actually rather strong. There's no sign at all that we're going to see any kind of breakdown of it. And in fact, because of where we are in the calendar, at this point, that split was already about halfway underway. So you haven't even started the process yet. If you were going to start the process now, it probably wouldn't really play out until the middle of March. And then by the time it were to work down to the lower part of the atmosphere, you're almost into April. So it's the next 10 days or so. If something in those short waves that are going to be moving across, if it times out correctly, you could possibly wind up seeing something happen. But if you're looking for something major to happen in the Northeast out of it, for snow lovers, for the coastal Northeast specifically, if you're looking for something major to happen, you're just not. I just don't see it. I don't. I wish, for you snow lovers, I wish I could tell you otherwise. But when it's there, I say it's there. When it's not there, I'm also going to say it's not there. Brandon Doherty, the idea of having a subpar winter was kind of front and center in my mind, right going into the winter. But if only because of the fact that we've had 6 in a row for much of the I-95 stretch, 6 winters in a row of above average snowfall, and particularly for the areas around New York City. It was bound to happen that we're going to have a subpar year. So that's where we're at, and I think the only way you could even bring some of those snow amounts in those areas 75 miles or less, if you go from the coast to 75 miles inland, inside that window from just north of Philadelphia up to about Portland, Maine, the only way you're going to be able to bring those snowfall amounts to normal at this point is to have one big blockbuster snowstorm, and it's not. I just don't see it. I just don't see it happening, given the pattern. So, look, we had a subpar year. If we're still in this decadal period where snows are going to be heavy in the I-95 corridor, then you could probably look forward to it coming back next year. Although there's nothing to say there can't be 2 subpar years in a row or 3 subpar years in a row for that matter. So, but we're just at 1, and we'll revisit all of that 7 or 8 months from now, but not now. Clearly, not now. Flagstaff has had more snow in one day than Minneapolis has had in February, and February set a record for them. Scott Briller, if you go, I went and looked in that part of the country, up in the plains and from Minnesota back through the Dakotas. This time of year is actually a low snowfall time of year. Their monthly snowfall averages are well under 10 inches in a lot of places in the northern plains, because in winters that are active, that's usually very cold and very dry up there. So you get a lot of these 1 to 2 inch events and these 1 to 2 inch blizzards that occur. But big storms are kind of unusual during the month of February. Maybe not so much in the latter part of the month if you got some early spring influence coming into the equation. But their snowfall averages actually go up for the month of March significantly, because there's a tendency for more storminess as you get into March, and the storm track begins to shift a bit further north as you start to get deeper and deeper into the early, you get closer and closer to early spring. You start to see more and more of these lows on average go further north, so they get into some of the heavier snows. So that explains why their records for February, you would think they would be much higher, but in fact they're not. January and February, their snow amounts are actually lower in terms of normals than they are for December and March. So you've got this, this big peak early, then it kind of drops down, and then it peaks again in March into April. That profile also holds if you look at Denver. Denver's kind of the same way. Big storms early, quiet in the middle, big storms late. They need that thermal gradient where you've got instances where very warm air comes up from the Gulf states, for example, when you set up these storms, and you get this sort of warm push that comes up into the western Gulf with temperatures into the 80s, and then you get one of these early cold air masses that comes down with temperatures down in the single digits and teens, and you wind up with these big snowstorms that occur sometimes in late October, November, and in through the first part of December. But once you get into the heart of winter in those areas, it's just too darn dry. Dio, analysis from the ensembles, what do you think is causing the Northeast snow hole? I don't know. Snow hole's kind of odd. Every year, when you look at the if you look at maps that show you where the actual snow totals are for say the Northeast or the Mid Atlantic or the U.S., there's always snow holes that show up. I'm not 100% sure why that would be. It could be specific to the kind of pattern that sets up, that perhaps it creates a condition over a certain area that winds up getting entrained. I'm just throwing things out there. It gets trained with dry air. If you notice how the last two events occurred that we've had here, they were pretty. They almost played out identical to each other. There were some differences, but the same areas that got a bonus, got more snow the first time, got more snow the second time, and the same areas that got less for the most part got less the second time. And I think it just has to do with how the whole upper air is set up. I think the Pacific jet is a big deal. The Pacific jet, that roaring jet, when it gets involved in these systems, as these systems come out in the eastern part of the United States, that Pacific jet, I think, ate away some of the snow. You had a pretty impressive area of snow on the radar going into Wednesday morning, and you had some dry air that got involved, but I think it was the warming, that strong Pacific jet pushing up that warmer air that just basically ate the snow, the snow area away over time. And and again, every year, I don't remember which winter it was, but there was a snow hole over southern Pennsylvania down into Maryland and northern Virginia for some reason. And everybody around there got, above average snowfall, but you had this hole that sat right over that particular area. Sometimes, in certain instances when you have lows that are coming from the west and they reach the mountains and they redevelop along the east coast, there's the area in between, just east of the Appalachians, you wind up seeing less snow there for a certain number of square miles, because the snow from the system in the west dries up as it comes east, and then that geographic area is too far west to pick up the snow that is developing from the coastal low. If you examine the long-term averages, you'll find that there are snow holes inside the averages, and that has to do with topography and the nature of how storms impact the eastern part of the United States. Muchacho saying typhoon east of Japan is recurving. Rule of thumb is trough in the east 7 to 10 days later. Trough in the east 7 to 10 days later. That could be the case. That is the case. If you look at how the upper air is behaving, we are going to have a trough in the east, but it doesn't automatically translate into necessarily into a snow event. You have this, the flow is at least from the way of the models showing up, you've got the trough in the east, but it's very flat, and if it stays flat, you're not going to be able to get too much out of it. And it doesn't really change much with the problem in the Atlantic jet, which is that the Atlantic jet is a fire hose from the southeast coast over into Europe. You need storms out there to create log jams, and you just don't have it, unfortunately. Mirtha Gunter, nice to see you on board tonight. It's always a pleasure when you're here. You brighten up the live stream and the company in the chat. And thank you for being here. Johnny Quest, are you rowing away yet with the fire hose setting up? Yep. More rain for you? Could be, unless that ridge in the east really pops. Maybe if the ridge in the east pops and the trough really drops down in the west, where systems go way west, that we might maybe get into a situation where the ridge is so strong that we could wind up being warm and dry. I don't know. Be nice to see. I have to tell you, quite honestly, I wouldn't mind an early spring, because I would love to get some early fishing out there. And Paul Roman, I think I gave you the answer to your question. The chances for a major snowstorm in the Northeast this winter for the coastal Northeast ain't looking good. Not with the pattern that we're seeing. Okay, 5,000 subscribers with no videos. If you don't get something decent in the next 10 days to 2 weeks, it ain't going to happen. The problem, by the way, Brandon, just addressing about the typhoon, the typhoon myth and all the rest of it, all these things do have impact. And the problem is everybody, a lot of people jump on the fact that because maybe on a number of times that we've had typhoons that have led to significant impact in the east, but then they forget about the number of times where it doesn't have significant impact on the weather in the east. Sometimes it makes the changes. Sometimes it makes the changes that are not nearly as dynamic. Sometimes the changes are more dynamic, and I think this time around the changes are not going to be dynamic enough to create anything noticeably different from what we've had. Troy Shannon, if I had the opportunity to design your own weather model, what changes would I make? I would actually, Troy, I'd take it this way. I was talking with my buddy Bill Goodman from the Weather Service, who I've had on before, and he made a great point. In the process of trying to make these models great and almost infallible, what they keep doing is they keep cramming more and more data into them. And I think what's happened is that has actually made them much more volatile and a lot worse. I'm not exactly sure why. I couldn't point to any specific data set, for example, and say, well, because we're putting in this particular data, it's creating these sorts of issues. But there's no, I think he makes a good point. I believe his observation with respect to going back maybe about 5 or 10 years ago, that the models were, they were volatile, but they were volatile where you understood them, okay, a bit better. And you can make the necessary adjustments that you need to make. I find that is becoming increasingly difficult. And you're having these problems, by the way, even in the short term models like the HRRR, for example, which had one stretch in the last year where it was just god awful. I mean, here's a model that only goes out 18 hours, and you would have having it doing things that were just way off. Mr. Lapointe is, I don't know what to say about Mr. Bastardi holding out hope. I really don't. I just don't. You can hope all you want. It's not going to make it happen, and the pattern's not there. Look, I'll leave you with this. With the flatness of the flow and all the short waves that are going to be running around, if you wind up timing something out absolutely perfectly, then yes, you could wind up with one last gasp of maybe a moderate snow event for the coastal areas of the east. Would I forecast that based on what I'm seeing now? No. Do I think that there is a high likelihood of that happening? No. It's going to have to be absolutely perfect. There are years when it snows a lot around here, and you notice in those years that we go into those storm situations days and days before, and you look at the models, and what winds up happening when the pattern is favorable is that all those pieces come together in a way that is supportive for bigger snowfalls and numerous snowfalls. You start out with the models showing you pieces, shortwave troughs, and then as you get closer and closer to those events, the models become more and more dynamic. In a year like this, the exact opposite has happened. How many times have we seen models throw out big snowstorms in the, not even in the long range, but even in the medium range, putting out big snowstorms? How many times has the European shown a big snowstorm on day 7 in its long range for the coastal areas of the Northeast, even to as much as day 6 or 5? How many of those have verified? None. Because the trend this year is that the trend in this pattern that we've been in is as we've gotten closer to the events, the models recognize the overall large-scale pattern of that Pacific jet just basically taking everything apart and rearranging it in a way that is not favorable for the coastal cities of the Northeast. And that's, why should that be any different this time around? Okay, I just don't think that it will be. All right, folks, wrapping up this Friday night. It's been fun. It's been a strong week. with all the activity that we've had, and now we've got this storm into the weekend. I need a little bit of downtime, so I don't know if I'm going to live stream tomorrow. I probably will try to do one, but if it winds up that I don't, then we'll have to just wait till to Sunday for it, because I'll need a break. So no promises, and if I do, it'll probably be at a haphazard time when I kind of feel like doing it. So just watch the channel. I'll put up a schedule as early as I have it figured out, and then we'll go from there. In the meantime, there will be continuing coverage, as always, as there always is, on my weather platform on Patreon, which, by the way, is a great way to not only extend your weather knowledge, in my opinion, but you get more live streams. You can message me at any time, and it's just $2 a month, which is the price of a cup of coffee. So if you would consider that as a great way to support what I'm doing with my YouTube videos, my websites, my free weather app, which is available for all platforms, and it kind of works for all areas because you can download the local forecast for your neck of the woods wherever you happen to be in the United States. So I've got the link up there on Patreon. And Brandon Doherty, congratulations! Yes, you have a Patreon page as well for Delaware. So if you're watching and you're from Delaware, take a look at Brandon Doherty's Patreon page, and give it a look. It'll do you a lot of good if you're in that area. Here is my Patreon page link, and in fact, hang on, if I can get my internet to not freeze, which it loves to do. Give me 1 second here. Give me a second, guys. So hang in there. Don't go away. Hang on. Just a moment. Oh, I just love it when this thing is so slow. Oh, here we go. Brandon, hang on 1 second, okay? Stay with me. So he's known as Delaware Weather Guy, okay? So here is Brandon's link if you want to take a look at his Patreon page. And tell me you lost me. Oh. Well, it looks like something happened to my computer where it shut the live stream down. So if you're still seeing me